we are in a state where we are realizing that we are not separate from machines anymore. And that doesn't mean that we are machines, and it doesn't also mean that machines are human, but it means that machines and humans together form the continuum of human life. And therefore, I'm so excited about these possibilities where we augment ourselves, for example, in your design workshops. Because it is true that we cannot live anymore without these machines.
So when you look at an implementation, right, there's all kind of different phases, there are all kind of different roles, and almost for every role in an implementation, GPT, but also Midjourney and like the generative AI, they offer a lot of opportunities to also increase production. And so we have this human-led, this design-led approach where we put the humans first. And I think that will stay. I think that especially when it comes to the adoption of generative AI, it's super important to actually involve the end users. You cannot just drop from one day to the another. You turn it on and you say, start using it. There will be a lot of resistance then. When you look at change management, that's not a one-day thing. That's something that starts already early on in the implementation. And that's also why we stick to a lot of human contact and get that going in a project. So we bring all the different departments together, we bring different people together. And even though some of these things, in theory, you could automate, sometimes the outcome of the workshop is not just about content creation. The outcome of the workshop is also a consensus. It's also smoothing out politics. It's also getting awareness. It's empathy, creating an understanding with each other on what we're trying to achieve and want to achieve with the project. And that's not some kind of scary thing. And even though we could automate it, automating like a brainstorm, which is great, and automating maybe the summary of the workshop, that's super. But if you didn't have the actual experience, the emotional experience, the sharing of thoughts in that workshop, and you just read the summary, you're not there yet. So we still rely, and we want to rely on that interpersonal contact within our implementations. But yeah, what I said before, right? Nobody cares if it's gonna be a business consulting spending 8 hours processing a whole workshop of 1 million post-its trying to get that into summary, or if an AI model like GPT does it in 8 minutes. That's not the value of the business consultant of being able to create that. So it's going to speed up a lot of our deliverables and a lot of our documentation. And it's going to switch from a business consulting needing to process all those post-its to basically getting the summary and then validating it. And that's going to be like that is already like a speed factor in our implementations when moving from the design phase, or when you move from we call it the creating the context phase or the discovery phase. There's different companies will use different names for that first phase, but there it already saves a lot. And when you look at the implementation itself, hopefully we don't do too much custom coding. But especially on the custom coding side, there's like an obvious 50% increase of productivity of our developers, of just being able to, in natural language, sometimes even with a user story in it, a prompt to a code base and getting a first draft code back. And then from there, actually making the adjustments. Or I think what I saw in the Einstein GPT one, where you basically have an autofill option for your Apex code, where you can just, it already tries to predict what you're trying to build, and you, with a simple tap, you just quickly build up a code base. And I think that's like a second area where we see a lot of productivity when it comes to that. I don't know how far the Salesforce features will go in terms of configuration and the generation of new fields and how much we can automate that. It's not publicly available, but we are currently really looking at our whole design-led approach in all phases, from really the first phase to the development phase to the go-live phase, and also the managed services and the let's say the roadmap afterwards on what parts of that we can augment with AI. Whether that is maybe in the future when we will have access to the pilot, it's Einstein GPT, but already we're talking to clients on being allowed to, at least in a closed environment, use the GPT from OpenAI to leverage. Yeah.
Right. I really like how you structured your argument just now, because there is this dangerous temptation with generative AI technology to focus only on the output, on the very thing that gets generated. But often there's a lot of value to be had from the process. And obviously you name the example of the design thinking process, where coming together and brainstorming has a lot of side effects that are unrelated almost to the very output that gets produced at the very end, such as coming together and empathy and all of these things. And the same is true for writing. Writing is also an act of structuring your thoughts. And we should not lose that. We should not lose the ability to structure our thoughts through writing. And if we only use generative technology to produce these pieces of text, we risk losing that. And therefore it's important to also keep thinking about this as an augmentation for those processes itself. I can very well imagine that you use generative technology also to maybe kickstart a brainstorm in your design thinking processes, where there may be at first a blank whiteboard syndrome where nobody knows where to start actually. Well, if you could have some prompts to get you started from a generative model, that may trigger further ideas. And it's almost as if you have this additional person in the room, which isn't really a person there.
The intern.
The intern, once again, helping you. And I think that is a very fascinating way also of how we are sort of augmenting our own abilities in our daily lives here.
And I think that's sort of I think that's going to be a big change in the consulting, right? We are now being innovative, trying to be in the front end of this new development. We are asking our customers, could we use it? Can we use it? Under which, how do we, like we were explaining them how they can protect their intellectual property, how they can stay GDPR compliant, but still leverage this technology. We hope, at least in a not so far future, that it's going to be the opposite way, right? That customers will just expect us to use this, or they're going to tell us to use it. Because if we don't use this, there's a lot of manual work that makes implementations risky, that makes implementations slow, and why wouldn't you use it, right? In some way, this is a calculator, and you're doing this math test, but we basically are now asking, can we use the calculator? And they're still saying, well, no. Well, at some point, there's a switch in please use your calculator, because we don't have all day.
Yeah. And these things don't come easy. These transitions don't come easy. If you allow me to talk for a moment about a book that I recently came across. It was already written 30 years ago by an American historian who was associated to MIT, and his name is Bruce Meslish. And he wrote this book called The Fourth Discontinuity. And him being an historian, he of course looks at the history of technological innovations in this case. And he reminisces several moments in history where humankind thought that there was a discontinuity, a gap, that turned out was not there. And the first one was when Copernicus showed us that the Earth is not the center of the universe. And he brought us from this geocentric to a heliocentric world vision. And that changed literally our worldview. The second time was when Darwin showed us that we are not separate from the animal kingdom, but that we are a part of it. And the third time was when Freud showed us that actually there is no brick wall divide between our conscious and our subconscious, but that in his definition of the tripartite brain, this works as one consistent organ. And now finally, we are in a state where we are realizing that we are not separate from machines anymore. And that doesn't mean that we are machines, and it doesn't also mean that machines are human, but it means that machines and humans together form the continuum of human life. And therefore, I'm so excited about these possibilities where we augment ourselves, for example, in your design workshops. Because it is true that we cannot live anymore without these machines. Human life without machines has become inconceivable, which is, if you think about it for a moment, a pretty massive fact. But I don't think that it is untrue. I think that really we form this continuum of human life together. We are now finding out how to do that in the best way. And the same societal turmoil exists as existed back in the other three discontinuities that were being closed.
And I think there's a lot to learn, right, from these historical views and research done also when you look at the communications media. I think in the 80s, I think it was Marshall McLuhan talking about the medium is the message, talking a lot about how when a new medium arrives, it's basically replicating the old medium, like the first websites were basically a flyer, right? And the first TV shows were basically a radio show. That's how they were set up. And that's what we're seeing now as well with these GPT examples, where GPT is being used in sort of an old-fashioned or an old way or a logical next step. And when we'll really see the innovation is when that innovation, the additional features that such a medium allows you to are becoming fully leveraged. And I think one example that we're seeing already, and we talked a bit about this before, is that a lot of the use cases we're seeing now are very much focused on employee productivity, and that still are being explained in a way where the other person is, let's say, still a human. So when we look at the marketing use cases, we see GPT being created to create messages for humans. When we look at the sales side, we still see messages that you're going to send emails to the buyer, for instance, on the other end. But what they're sort of missing so far is that it's also going to be the opposite. That buyer, that customer, will also be able to leverage this technology. So a lot of the use cases are basically hey, we invented a mobile phone, but you can only call to a landline. And that's kind of weird because the other person will also have a mobile phone. So it's going to be mobile phone to mobile phone. And that same will be applied to these language models, that it's going to be a bot-to-bot world as well. And the use cases so far are missing out on that, because why would you optimize a message to a human if the other person is not a human? And that's kind of an interesting part. So we're doing quite a lot of, so we're a professional services company. I think that industry by far is going to be hit hardest by this GPT and this generative AI. But what we're seeing is we have to talk about B2B marketing when you're not just negotiating with one person, you're actually negotiating with a whole group of people, an organization. So rather than a one-on-one conversation, it's going to be a 2-on-2 or a 3-on-3 or a 9-on-9. And that's what actually going to be also the dynamic for bots, because you're not necessarily going to have one bot. You already mentioned the niche bots, the specialist bots, but it's going to be a multitude of bots talking basically to each other, trying to get in an almost Monte Carlo situation of how do we get the optimal situation for both parties.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It makes me think of a post that Sam Altman once tweeted, where he said that it's actually fundamentally strange that there's a human drafting a few bullet points asking ChatGPT to compose an email out of it that gets then sent to another human, and the first thing that human does is pull it through ChatGPT to summarize it into bullet points. So we are indeed in this sort of strange twilight zone now and trying to figure out how to best harness this technology. While we're at it, we should also not forget that these models are indeed trained to produce output that is as we would have produced it, because that's what they were trained on. They were trained on all these pieces of text that we put out there on the web. So it's not necessarily optimized also to produce output that is well understood by another system. Why would two systems talk to each other in natural language? That's the question. So to use your mobile phone landline example, yeah, these models are actually mobile phones that are by definition very good at calling landlines.
And that is definitely a dynamic that we're going to have to address. And if you look at your strategy as a business as well, it's not just about that human on the other side, even though it's optimized for that. It's also going to be being able to handle that. And if you let's be a bit more speculative, right? This is not, we're going to in an area where things may not have been invented, where we're sort of letting our brains go a bit. So feel free to speculate, but don't buy based on these.
Maximum forward-looking statement.
Exactly.
Here.
Yeah. But let's say you're a marketeer and you have a website online. I think recently the plugin for OpenAI for browsing is there. Should you start monitoring if OpenAI is browsing your website? Should you offer that OpenAI a different version of your website that is optimized to that specific, to the way that functions? Or like, how do you see this, let's say, bot-to-bot world?
I think in the bot-to-bot world, it becomes again a question of what do we optimize these models for? And we have a lot of, again, programmatic text out there. We have a lot of programming language out there, which is not a language, right? It's the language that we use to interact with computers. We tell what a computer should do through a programming language. We don't have so many examples out there of how these systems would talk to each other, right? Is there sufficient protocol data available of two systems conversing with each other in a protocol? Or maybe should we even think of letting those systems let loose and start developing their own protocol? And then I think we are a little bit outside of the scope of just training a large language model, but we end more in this reinforcement learning branch of algorithms where we let agents figure out themselves how to best operate given a certain set of constraints. But at the same time, that's also a bit of the scary scenario, right?
I think a few years ago, right, Facebook did this. They let basically two bots talk to each other, let them loose reinforcement-wise, and they actually shut them down at a moment because they were talking in a language that the humans just didn't understand anymore. They just took out a lot of, let's say, from a linguistic perspective, a lot of information that is there to allow us to, well, that's redundant. That's not necessarily core to what you're trying, to the information that you're trying to get across. And they sort of created their own language to that. So that's basically what you're telling, right? There is probably a more efficient language of transferring information than the human natural language. And if you would get into a bot-to-bot world, that language would be actually the one that's used also for sustainability purposes of having low energy, right?
Right.
So that's actually what you want.
And I think that the development of those systems should also be subject to regulation. And I sense that most of the regulation that's currently being devised is strongly oriented towards the system to human communication. It's also, of course, around taking decisions, but it's a lot around how we interact with those systems. And is that truthful? And is that biased? And is that neutral? And is that fair? So I think, and safe. And I think a lot of the legislation is being devised on that area. And I think that we should never forget to also consider this scenario of system-to-system integration and system-to-system communication that will get optimized through this field as well. And there are tremendous opportunities here, but there are also tremendous risks. And I think that those risks need to be addressed when we are building this legislation, and we would definitely encourage companies and governments getting closer together in building up this legislation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And legislation will be always behind innovation, but it doesn't mean that you stop trying to get there, right? So It should be a continuous effort for that.
Absolutely.
I think another topic that I would like to touch upon that's related to this is you already talked about specialized algorithms, specialized language models that are really good and optimized for one thing. So let's say one of those is optimized for negotiation, and let's say people have this as a personal assistant. I can imagine that if every of your customer has an optimized professional negotiator, it will do something with your business strategy, right? How do you feel about that?
I think what you're asking is touching upon also this notion of converging to the average. Will everything ultimately come to a stable point? Because if we have these bots communicating to each other and negotiating, what is then the end result of that? And I personally believe that we are living in a chaotic universe. Because if that would indeed converge to a stable average, then why haven't the stock markets done so already? It's because we are living in a chaotic universe and there is more happening than in that what is just being controlled by these bots. So even if we were having, an immense amount of system-to-system communication, I don't think that that would converge to an average. I think that there will be sufficient random, or at least universally controlled chaotic inputs, let me put it like that, that will still cause every business to need to devise their own strategy and to react in their point of view on these new circumstances, even if bots take part of the reaction to those circumstances.
I think there's two things additional that I think about in this sense of having these bot-to-bot world and being. There's one aspect of, let's say of speed and innovation. If you're in a B2B world or even in a B2C world, the side of the purchase that gets to this bot first will have their threshold lowered so much on being able to communicate and to generate these purchases that it could flood your channels. I mean, if it was basically as simple as one click to get a discount at your favorite store, you can imagine that store will be flooded by everybody pressing a button. So if the consumer is first in being able to leverage a virtual assistant in those purchases, and your customer service or your sales department or your marketing department is not ready, is not first to be able to receive such a volume, there's going to be a risk that you're going to be completely flooded and completely it's going to be sand in your machines, right? It's going to stop your business from working. And I think a second part is in the power dynamics is the let's say more manipulation or the power balance in between. So if indeed on that negotiation the algorithms that consumers will be leaning on, or your customers are leaning on, your business customers, is better at the negotiation, it will put pressure on your margins, and it will put pressure on, for instance, your promotional strategy. If you look now, Google can already find, and there's a lot of websites already trying to find like the promotion codes, and there's this whole sharing of trying to get the lowest price. But it's still a lot limited to, let's say, the top 10 results of that search, because as a human, I will not look further than the 10th result that I'm seeing. And if I don't see it in the first 10, I assume it doesn't exist. But these algorithms are so fast, are so expensive, or could at least be that they don't stop at the 10th search result. So everything is going to be found. Everything that can be found will be found. And that also means that in that business conversation, a bad review that's maybe now in the 6th page of Google that no consumer is going to see could suddenly surface quite easily by these algorithms. The same goes for discounts. The same goes for promotions, promotion predictions. There's, especially on the commercial strategy of businesses, there's a lot of risk and a lot of change coming that you need to already be getting ready for.
Which is, if you think about it, an extension of the world that they are already living in. We are already living in a world of information overload. And as you say, that Google phenomenon with the top 10 being the only ones being looked at is already there. It's just going to put that on steroids. And it definitely needs planning. And the speed with which this is happening is incredible. So I fully agree with you.
That's an interesting one. Also, if you look at, let's say, the old mediums, right? If you look at the Google has this algorithm of sort of determining what is the value of a certain website, what's the value of a certain content. If you are optimized your website, you can actually optimize your website to be like a higher hit on Google, right? If you know how the algorithm works. So how will this change, right? There will be companies, or there will be the opportunity where you can basically tell your large language model or your model on how important or how likely do I want to actually see automated text. I think Google in the early phases at least already announced that if you're going to put all generated content in your website and we recognize that it's being automatically generated, we'll rank you lower because we would value a human source above the mechanical source, the bot source. And I think that there's a lot of weight to it when you talk about what is true. It's also what is desirable. And If you assume that there will be multiple of those virtual assistants, let's say, like with search, you have like the Microsoft version, you have the Google version, there may be others. Each one of those might be slightly differently fine-tuned on how they represent your brand and how they think about your brand or what you do with it, right? So there's this whole, instead of search engine optimization, maybe this is also part of that sort of, how do you ensure that the bots that will be used are representing your company in the right way? How do you can sort of put your image, how can you put your perception in there?
I think in a way we have gotten very used to the concept of an external universal truth.
So I think that if you at least assume that there will be multiple of these bots, let's consider them sort of browsers, right? They're your browser. They're going to be probably your new browser to whatever information you're going to need to consume, etc. It could actually make sense in your CRM system to mark or to create a field or to create in some way a detection mechanism that detects which language model that specific customer is using. Because it could well be that the version of Google, that Bart from Google versus Bing from Microsoft, that they have a slightly different way of weighing, they're slightly differently trained, they're slightly different, maybe have different principles, as you mentioned, like Salesforce has. So you might actually want to adjust your content, your website, your branding, your sales page, your marketing page, to the specifics of that model. So being able to personalize on the human level, there will be, let's say, an additional version to it. So maybe CRM, I don't know if the word C, maybe we should get, besides the customer, a AI in there as well. AI relationship model.
Relationship management.
Yeah.
Who knows, perhaps the C at some point will become less important, at least in that definition. But of course, even though it's an AI customer, the customer will still be at the center of everything.
And behind it,
Yeah.
right? And the real decision maker.
And what is relevant then remains still also the key question. What is then relevant to you as a customer? What is relevant to you as a AI customer that sits behind your customer?
So how does that AI determine what is relevant? That is, I think, the key to solve, and why a lot of companies will not necessarily give open wide their algorithms and the way why it was trained and how it was trained. Because this opens up for manipulation and, let's say, creating a better version of what is actually real.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for this thought-provoking conversation. Actually, I have a million more topics in mind, but maybe we'll tackle that next time.
We'll tackle that next time. It was a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast.